The ancient world regarded the Adriatic as a difficult sea and called it inquietus for the strong gusts of northeastern winds, obscurus because overcast by sudden banks of fog, iracundus due to the storms that made sailing complicated and often wrecked ships as they attempted to find shelter in ports or safer landing places. The deep, sandy seabeds reveal traces time has tried to hide. Pieces of wood, amphoras, driftwood, whole shiploads or fragments that speak of distant trading and commerce, of the broken lives of the many who had set their ships' courses between the east and the west in far-off times. Merchants and sailors who brought, together with the goods, ancient cults, stories of myths and heroes who would protect them because they themselves had, in a time before time, already sailed across this sea. Caput Adriae was the last frontier, a space that ancient sources indicated as the furthest limit of the sea in the north. Here, land and sea caravan routes intertwined at the edge of the great lagoon out of which Venice was to rise, and where, as from the second millennium BC, contacts with the preclassical cultures of the Aegean began. The Mycenaean people emerged as a powerful presence and were the first to create a network of contacts and exchanges, not only of material goods, but also of ideas, cults, uses and customs. In this distant gulf, the proto-historical roots of the commerce of amber ended and started over again. Here was the Lacus Timavi, an expanse of water where land and sea met, and where the Timavo re-emerged, a river with a mysterious underground course. The water today can be seen among trees and rocks. The slow current forms marshlands and brackish lagoons, and reaches a coastline that is different from what it once was. The ancient coastline, where the sea almost reached the slopes of the Cast near Monfalcone, and the Lacus covered what is now an industrial zone. The seawater, mixing with the fresh water of the river, almost reached the Moschenizza hill, on the verge of the modern road towards San Giovanni di Duino, and closed the mouth of the Timavo with a system of sandbanks and islands. The particular charm of this environment enthralled many Greek and Latin authors. Nature itself seemed to open passages between the world of men and the world of gods, making sacred the water and the woods, where wolves were said to live peacefully side by side with deer, both protected by divine power. Throughout time, the ancient presence of Homeric heroes, kings and warriors, sailors and merchants have mixed here with the real world of settlements, from prehistoric times to as far as the end of the Roman Empire, and to the great climatic upheavals of the 6th century AD that altered the landscape in a significant and almost definitive way. After having burnt down and defeated the town of Troy, the journey home would become complicated and difficult for the victorious Achaean kings, and for the surviving Trojan princes to search for new lands. And so the nostoi were created, stories and poems of these journeys, where the opposition of the gods, enraged by ancient offences, mixed with the adversities of nature and the hostility of men. The Greek Diomedes, the reigning prince of Argolis, and the Trojan Antenor, the king's wise counsellor, crossed the Adriatic. There are many different landings, but there is only one point where the two events seem to meet and mix in a land of borders, the Lacus Timavi. The myth, which in time stratifies and is enriched with various nuances, often tells of events that have really taken place, but hides, for example, stories of trade and ancient commerce, of exploration of unknown territories, of the occupation and foundation of new cities. It is not coincidental that this is the area crossed by the Argonauts, the inventors of ships, and by Daedalus, he who builds. It is not by chance that Antenor and Diomedes, founders of new cities, were here venerated and became founders of families destined to become powerful, that would put down roots in the Aegean lands as well as in the extreme northeastern plains. Mythical figures tied to the Mycenaean world and that testified to it having been peacefully penetrated by trade. The source of the Timavo became a demarcation line of contrast between civilized lands, those of the ancient inhabitants of Veneto, and lands that were still wild, inhabited by the Histri tribes, as well as a meeting place where it was possible to trade under the protection of the gods and the ancient heroes. The echo of the waters, the springs of water flowing from the rocks, the warm steam emanating out of the earth, the rustle of the wind, the desolate appearance of the stony ground, the darkness of the caves. All this might have created the sensation of being in a different dimension, both earthly and supernatural. And in the woods, sacred and dedicated to Hera Agiva and Artemis Itole, lady of the animals, Antenor brought breeding of white horses. These were sacrificed to Diomedes, who Homer called their tamer. Behind the myth is the trade of these animals carried out since the distant past by the Greeks themselves. But Antenor, conqueror of the people who inhabited Istria and Dalmatia, would become with time also symbol of the conquest of these lands by Rome. Rome, which was in alliance with the people of Veneto, and which in 181 BC founded Aquileia, whose inhabitants still in the 2nd century AD were called Antenoridi, as a votive altar found here testifies, that is, descendants of the ancient Homeric hero, and in this still more deeply tied to Rome, which in another Trojan prince, Aeneas, has its roots. On the banks of the river that myth called Eridanos, tall poplar trees cry tears of amber. They are the Heliades nymphs that the gods have transformed, moved to pity by their grief for the death of their brother Phaeton, and the amber becomes a magical gift that is therapeutic for the loss of a divine being. A careless child who had wanted to drive the sun father's cart, but unable to govern it, had gone too close to the earth. Zeus's lightning struck him. His body fell and plummeted into the waters of the Caput Adriae. Where? In the area closest to the Timavo? In the water of the Isonzo River? In the Po Delta? What the myth hides are different but complementary realities. There existed, in fact, ancient trade routes of this raw material, whose final destinations on the Adriatic coast were important manufacturing and commercial centres. One of these started from the Baltic Sea, following big rivers, reaching the Isonzo Valley and then the sacred and commercial area of Lacus Timavi. In time, new routes grew up, and the amber continued its journey always towards the west, towards the great Venetian Lagoon as far as the opposite seashore, attracted in the 6th century by the great markets of Adria and Spina, two towns which once more, according to tradition, was said to be founded by Diomedes. What the myth hides is a reality that has not yet completely revealed itself, a path that from the lagoon goes towards the mainland, following an ancient waterway, the River Po in Adria, now no more, where recent archaeological excavations have brought to light in Grignano in the Polesine area the traces of a settlement dated between the 13th and 12th centuries BC. A settlement of huts in which an entire area was dedicated to making things out of amber. Lumps of amber, semi-finished or finished beads, and thousands of fragments. Signs that this was a place where the Bronze Age merchants used to bring the raw material to be worked in order then to sell it throughout the entire Mediterranean basin. And the most interesting thing is the very manner in which this fossil resin was worked, creating beads of a particular style and shape, made for a trend launched by the Mycenaean world and named after the preclassical Greek rock where they were found for the first time. They are the so-called Tiryns beads. An exceptional discovery was made in Grignano Polesine that can be placed side by side with the findings of Fratesina of Frate Polesine, another proto-historic settlement along the banks of the Po of Adria, that has revealed amber products mostly in the funerary equipment of its power elites. For the archaeologists, therefore, amber, which the Greeks called electron, brilliant and luminous material, substance of the sun, is one of the most important signs, together with pottery, testifying to the contacts that the Mycenaean world had with the Upper Adriatic. Fratesina has yielded, together with fragments of pottery, small terracotta idols, typical of that preclassical world. Fragments of Mycenaean Greek vases dating from around the height of the Bronze Age in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC were found in Istria around the most ancient walls of the Acropolis of Moncodogno, an impressive structure rising above Rovigny. This is one of the best conserved examples of fortified settlements, which the archaeologists have called Castellieri. A true civilization that becomes tangible proof of the passing through and migration of peoples from east to west also becomes proof of a network of contacts, of meetings, perhaps of clashes between different peoples. Here are signs of ancient structures that knew well how to exploit a territory, from Istria to the Karst Plateau to the plains of Friuli and beyond. It is not easy to study the civilization of the Castellieri, which, depending on the areas studied, presents a complex situation whose outlines are not yet well defined. From the excavations and the objects found, scholars have ascertained the very long lifespan of the settlements of these areas. It is known that boundary walls were often repaired or with time widened. There are signs of commerce with the production of pottery and the manufacture of metals, next to finds that speak of contacts between the Castellieri and, with time, of exchanges with remote areas, on one side towards the Danube and on the other side towards southern Italy and the eastern Mediterranean. What seems to be almost a network of fortified sites has been identified around Lacus Timavi, sites that we must imagine to be very similar to Moncodogno, that exploit many stony hills, starting from Mount Falcone, in the spot where the rock that dominates the modern town of Monfalcone now rises. In the early 1900s, at the time of the excavations of the Triestine archaeologist Carlo Marchesetti, the boundary wall of this Castellieri was preserved for a length of 140 meters. The settlement was within sight and connected to the settlement of Castellazzo of Doberdo. Not far off was the Castellieri of Vertace on the hill of Arupa Cupa, near the settlement of Yamiano, with a bailey of more than a kilometre, according to Marchesetti, one of the biggest. And then also San Polo, Golas, Forcate, Moschenizze, Flonda, Mount Hermada. What has been found in this Castellieri seems to indicate that this area was initially settled in the Bronze Age, in the 16th century BC, and the settlement came very slowly to an end around the middle of the 4th century BC. This is perhaps a sign that the economic and commercial interests of the inhabitants were shifting towards the coast. Towards the docks of Stramare in Muggia, closely connected with the high ground of San Servolo, where some surveys do not exclude the possibility of a pre-Roman phase in the early location of Trieste. On the other side of the gulf, the settlement of Duino became more and more important. Why exactly Duino? The answer comes from the exceptional finds of ceramic fragments that the underwater surveys have brought to light in the area of the mouth of the Timavo at a depth of 7 meters, in the third mouth or third branch of the river, on the left banks at about a kilometre from where the river now re-emerges. Here, fragments of large pots have been found, in which foodstuff was preserved. Bowls, olle or jars, similar to other containers found in the Castellieri in areas around Trieste, in Istria, in Santa Lucia of Tolmino, and in eastern Veneto. This is indirect evidence of a proto-historic landing place used for exchange and trading between different people, under the protection of divine forces that revealed themselves through mysterious natural phenomena and guaranteed men and goods as if it were almost a sort of duty-free area. There is the mystery of the waters here, where the Timavo re-emerges, and the mystery of the waters there, where the river disappears, in San Canciano del Carso, in Slovenia. This is a site of a castelliere in the area where today there is a church overlooking the karst chasm that swallows the water. At the foot of the boundary wall, in a simple hole covered by a slab of stone, a considerable quantity of objects were found in 1908, again by Marchesetti. There were objects of bronze, iron, bone, pottery, glass paste and amber. They formed perhaps the funerary equipment of a lady of high rank, or an offer to the gods, or objects that a craftsman trader had hidden, or even a hiding place where the inhabitants of the Castelliere, pressed by danger, had gathered and deposited their most precious belongings. Maybe. The finds, 1,170 artifacts, almost all of them ornaments, datable between the second half of the 5th century and the first half of the 4th century BC, and the extraordinary quantity of amber, gave rise to the hypothesis that the Castellieri of San Canciano was an important marketplace between the Adriatic and the Danube, one of the fundamental stages for the commerce of the precious fossil resin, and it could also have had the role of sanctuary, of a sacred area like the Lacus, linked to a particular environment full of chasms and caves, where the Timavo disappeared into the dark. The small treasure of San Canciano stops the clock in the middle of the 4th century BC to mark a moment of danger that concerns the entire area of the northern Adriatic, and in particular the Castellieri of the karst, that exactly in that period were abandoned by the inhabitants, frightened by something that pushed them to take refuge in areas that could be better defended. Towards the coast, where survival was in any case guaranteed by trading carried out with people from ancient Veneto, from the Po Valley, and from mainland Italy. Danger was always present, as is suggested by the arms found in the burial grounds of San Servolo, in the tombs of men who had also been warriors and who asked to be buried with helmets, battle axes, and iron spearheads. This was the time in which the great migrations from over the Alps and from the east took place. Groups of Celtic people, those who literary sources would in time call the Gauls, who exerted pressure with raids that went deeper and deeper into territory, causing devastating effects that Rome itself in 390 BC would know of. The balance of power changed and reformed in a different manner. In the 3rd century BC, Rome appeared in the Po Valley and in the lands of the people of Veneto, with which it would enter into strong alliance, a sign of recognition for having stopped the Gallic danger by creating a barrier against their forays that had in fact blocked trading between the north and the south. The sphere of Veneto's control grew well beyond the Tagliamento River, and the Lacus Timavi became the borderland, where it was possible to enter into contact with the Histri, people of the sea and of trade. Thus the Romanization period began, which as usual meant at first penetration through commerce, acquaintance and mutual exchange of cults, beliefs and myths, and then political and military control of the new territories. An early trace of this process is that left by the votive bronzes, small images of deities produced in central Italy and brought to Caput Adriae by merchants who made the most of their journey towards the mining districts from over the Alps by selling here their finished products that were very much in demand because of popular religious beliefs. One such example was Hercules, the protector of pastoral farming. Most of the commerce that took place in ancient times, however, relied on sea routes, and Roman merchants quickly noticed that sailing in the waters of the Caput Adriae was extremely difficult due to the serious disturbance caused by the sailors of the Histri. This situation sparked off a series of clashes, expeditions and wars that saw the arrival of armies and fleets in this area from the end of the 3rd to the end of the 2nd century BC. For the Histri, the date of 177 BC marks irreversibly the end of their civilization, with the fall of Naxaxium, a political and religious centre in which all the tribes had their reference point. An end that began in the stretch of sea that opened before Lacus Timavi. A sea battle first, a clash on dry land later, saw the rout of the Histri warriors led by Epulon, that ended within the walls of besieged Naxaxium. Rather than lose their freedom, the warriors and the king preferred to die. The Roman peace descended on Lacus Timavi, which continued to exercise its archaic charm, still connected with nature. An area that also Rome considered as sacred, and perhaps right in this period, one of the first buildings of worship made its appearance, thus breaking with the tradition of the religious world of the people of Veneto that found its full expression in nature. An interesting theory, rising out of the archaeological evidence found in Aquileia. Fragments of a very high artistic quality are preserved in the Archaeological Museum of the town, and they still bear traces of coloured pigments, part of the terracotta decoration of the gable of one of the earliest temples built in the town and discovered in 1884 in Monastero near the river Natissa. They were very simple temples, with a wooden structure covered in fictile slabs, painted with very lively colours. In the fragments which have been found, the shaping of the figures and the complexity of representation lead one to think of a high-ranking customer and workers who were not local. There are, however, few elements remaining which would help in identifying the scene. Thus, the male and female figures depicted have been interpreted in a variety of ways. Perhaps a scene in which Apollo dominates, a deity who defends a civilized world. The client could have been Claudius Pulcher, the consul who in 177 triumphed over the history of Epulon. Maybe the figures are Diomedes, Hera Agiva, and Artemis Itola, and a connecting link may be found with the consul Tuditanus, who in 129 BC settled the score with the history and erected a statue in the Lacus Timavi area to the deities who had helped him, and a temple in Aquileia dedicating to the Timavo an epigraph made up of 2 fragments, one of which came from Monastero. With the foundation of Aquileia, Rome thus entered permanently in the scenery of Lacus Timavi, and as always happened, began to reorganize the territory in accordance with the logic of military, economic and cultural choices. It did not cancel, but rather took over what it found. Starting from the network of proto-historic tracks, almost all transformed into roads, and that arrived from the west and the north, crossing this distant strip of land in the Venetorum Angulus. The ancient link with Lacus Timavi was also maintained and made more easily accessible for traffic. One of the legions, the 13th most likely, worked on the road and surely built a bridge. The bridge that used to cross the Lokovats, a short river going from the Pietro Rosso lake as far as the Timavo. There remains, in fact, this square block of Aurasina stone found in 1929, not far from the mouths of the river, on which the name of the legion has been engraved. A legion that was part of Julius Caesar's troops during his proconsulship in Cisalpine Gaul, and that would follow him in the year 49 BC in the crucial crossing of the Rubicon River. The legion, during the imperial era, would take the name of Gemina, a name that would also be given to the road, the Gemina Road, which connected Aquileia to Trieste and then to Istria, and remains to this day in modern toponymy. We must at this point reconstruct a natural scenery that no longer belongs to our times. Through 9 mouths with a huge roar, the river flows down from the mountain high up. Virgil tells in the Aeneid that which has now been lost forever. The Timavo flowed from the slopes of the karst, with various waterfalls sweeping down towards the sea. Waterfalls where mysteriously, with the exception of one, fresh water already mixed with salt water. The coastline was very different, and so was the gulf that received the Timavo's waters. Deep and secure, protected by an island which lay parallel to the coast and closed it in like a natural breakwater. The stretch of water inside was so calm that it earned the name of Lacus, lake. The island, now conquered by the dry land that has completely incorporated it, had a characteristic that amazed those who saw it. Although it was not big, it had an elongated shape that rose up at the ends, forming 2 low hills. The tides covered and uncovered the central part, probably a thin strip of land, one moment giving the illusion of one island, and the next of 2. Those that scholars call the Insula Clarae, the famous islands, remembered by Pliny the Elder in the 1st century AD. Today, the only thing that remains of these 2 low hills is a name, given to them in an era in not so distant times, that of Sant'Antonio and of Punta, or of Amarina, and a stretch of land that has escaped the industrialization that has flattened all this area. On the western hill, the bigger one, called Sant'Antonio, there are still hot springs, these too influenced by the tides, and the remains of the ancient Roman systems that exploited their therapeutic characteristics. What remains of the fame of these waters, fame that stretched as far as Veneto, Dalmatia, and the territories today on the border between Italy and Austria are some inscriptions, all datable between the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, dedicated as ex voto to the fons, or to the fontes, or to the spes, hope that had favoured healing, or to Hercules, god of the healing force. And hope is thanked in a good 4 of these inscriptions that were found near the church of San Giovanni in Tuba. 3 have been made part of the wall in the apse of the sacred building. Where could these ex voto have been left? Was there a place of worship? And where was it? Question still without an answer. And how many people used to visit the sacred area, or used to go to the watering place? Where were they able to stay? Archaeological excavations were carried out, in fact, inside what is known today as the Del Randaccio aqueduct. The remains of a very elaborate building have been found here. Its characteristics have led to it being identified as a mansio, a place where you could stop off or stay over for some days and enjoy a series of facilities, from areas for the change of and the shelter for horses and carts to restaurants. With extraordinary correspondence, the Tabula Peutingeriana, one of the most famous road maps of antiquity, conceived in the 4th century AD and that has come down to us in a medieval version, in this point draws a big square-shaped building with the inscription Fonte Timavi. The way in which it is shown identifies either structures linked to the use of the waters or of the mansio. A sort of hotel of ancient times, built at the beginning of the 1st century BC, embellished and enlarged in the succeeding centuries, right up to the 4th century AD. To date, 1,300 square meters have been dug, bringing to light 40 rooms. Almost all of them have preserved their mosaic floors and the remains of frescoes which have the same pattern in some of the rooms. A repetitiveness that then, like today, distinguishes the fitting out of the interiors of a hotel. In 1911, Enrico Maionica, director of the Museum of Aquileia, while digging near the 19th century spa building, on the western side of that which had been the island, brought to light traces of a 5-roomed building, with floors made of small terracotta cubes, plastered walls, and the vestiges of frescoes. In the 1970s, not far from here, other remains came to light, those of a large villa, later called Villa della Punta. Was it in some way linked to the buildings that used the beneficial waters nearby? Was there a sole owner of both the residence and the thermal spring baths? A high-ranking dominus who had decided to exploit the warm and abundant waters that flowed here, with facilities open to all, as well as furnishing his luxurious home with a wealth of mosaics and frescoes, and pools with steps for his family and guests. Visitors, guests of the villa or of the beneficial spas, would have arrived here from the dry land with boats like this one, now at the Archaeological Museum of Aquileia, found at the point in which the island seemed to split into 2, near the remains of the Villa della Punta. About 11 meters long, made entirely of wood without nails. An important example of the high technical degree reached by the Roman carpenters. The first nucleus of the Villa della Punta, like the mansio, dates back to the second half of the 1st century BC. This period, first under Julius Caesar, later under Octavian Augustus, was marked by a thorough reorganization of the entire territory, where high-ranking villas were built. The only information that remains of some of these can be found in the historical archives. Of others, the information obtained thanks to land surveys is scarce. Only 2, the villa in Via delle Mandrie and the villa in Via Colombo, the name is given by present-day toponymy of Monfalcone, have been methodically surveyed and excavated. The Roman architects' choices had been influenced by the view of the sea and the spectacular impact of the water. In Lacus Timavi, the modifications the ancient environment has undergone and man's intense exploitation of the territory do not make it possible any longer to capture the close relationship sought between buildings and nature, and it is no longer even possible to continue digging in order to bring fully to light all these ancient structures. We can, however, imagine the scene that at that time opened up before an onlooker's eyes, when looking at the coasts of Istria and the neighbouring sites of Dragonera and Barbariga, villas of the territory of ancient Pola. Of the first, there are considerable remains of the walls, whose layout is that of a self-contained site in close contact with the seashore. The villa of Barbariga, on the other hand, was almost entirely excavated at the beginning of the 1900s, and then slowly covered over again by the earth. Like many of the villas of the Lacus Timavi, this one too had a U-shaped layout. All the rooms rotated round a large three-branched colonnade that looked out onto a central court opening onto an external landscape, thus offering the inhabitants and the guests striking views. In the villas of Via delle Mandrie, Via Colombo and Via della Punta, the rooms, one beside the other, also opened out onto a central courtyard, each room designed for a specific use. In general, the triclinium, that is the dining room, was in the middle, while all the bedrooms, the cubicola, in particular, were placed at the ends of the branches of the U-shape, perhaps in order to be in a more peaceful and quiet position. The kitchen was usually in one of the corners where the two branches of the house joined, for practical reasons, and in order not to irritate the guests with the smoke and the smells. The harsh climate and the strong Bora wind that swept in a blustering fashion over these lands made it necessary to heat at least some of the rooms, which today can be identified by whoever excavates by two elements, both present in the villa of Via delle Mandrie: a wood-burning stove and the discovery of suspensure, that is, columns made of bricks that created a hollow space between the floor and the foundations. The heat produced by a small masonry heater passed under the floor and was directed by means of special pipes, also made of terracotta. The house had reception rooms with mosaic floors, and as in the case of many villas of the Lacus, frescoed walls with colourful geometric or flower motifs. Other rooms had walls plastered in a simple manner, in white or red, with a floor made of small terracotta bricks, and they were used for daily activities such as the spinning of wool and the weaving of cloth. A sign of the sophistication of these villas, and thus of the owner's wealth, is given by the discovery of great quantities of glass fragments that had been used for windows, or perhaps to create large glass windows to close a colonnade or parts of it. But there is more. All these villas had a part dedicated to the production of agricultural or farm products. There was an important production of wool that came from flocks of sheep with long, fine fleece. The excavation of the villas of Monfalcone has made it possible to understand that in Via delle Mandrie there was a dock and an area for breeding fish for food in Via Colombo, clues that speak of water and of fish farming in a place that has been dry land for centuries. The Timavo area was in fact famous for its tender, white-fleshed and savoury bass, which in the 1st century AD the poet Marziale recalled in one of his epigrams, and shellfish like oysters and murexes, which were very much appreciated and were used both for food as well as to dye cloths of a very precious and costly purple. Great quantities of oil were produced in the oil presses. Significant traces of the equipment used remain in the Villa della Punta. Equally famous was the production of wine, in particular the puccinum that Pliny mentioned as being generated in the bosom of the Adriatic Sea, not far from the mouth of the Timavo. On a stony hill it soaked up the breath of the sea and filled just a few amphoras. There were also various activities that gravitated around the settlement: potters and smiths, manufacturers of bricks and tiles. The furnaces found near the Lacus River testify to this. Moving from the sea to the karst plateau, an important element in the sacred landscape of Lacus Timavi. Not far from the mouths of the river, on the slopes of Mount Hermada, there is one of the most important archaeological discoveries that this area has given back. The only Mithram in a cave known in Italy. A place of worship linked to Mithras, the Iranian god of light and rebirth, born from stone, and who in a cave had killed a bull and had fertilized the earth with its blood. A mystery cult that reached this place in the second half of the 1st century AD, for men only, that found favor above all among soldiers. Long counters were put opposite each other and used for the ritual banquet of bread and wine. At the back of the hollow, the sacred image of the relief with the killing of the bull, donated by an initiate, Aulo Tullius Palmiano, whose name has remained on a stone slab. Oil lamps lit up the darkness, and more than 100 lamps have been found here. The cult came to a sudden end around the middle of the 5th century AD, when the holy vessels of the cave were profaned, destroyed by Christians, and perhaps in part hidden by the very same followers of Mithras. Not far in the same period, in a significant time correlation, the first Christian basilica was built in the place where the medieval church of San Giovanni in Tuba now stands. Here the earth has given back a large terracotta mortar used for sacred rites, with Numen Saturni, divine essence of Saturn, inscribed 4 times. Saturn was the ancient god of water, but he was the guardian of the highest grade of Mithraic initiation. The basilica, that would survive through different phases, was from the start named after St. John the Baptist, a choice that was certainly not coincidental for a figure who with Christ's baptism was linked to water. It was almost as if the sacredness of the sites, fading away from the pagan world, could pass intact to that of the new religion. Slowly, however, life around Lacus Timavi changed. Nature itself seemed to want to change its centuries-old rhythms. The environmental upheaval of the 6th century would be great, an upheaval that was to be added to the political and economic consequences which followed the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, and to the entry on the scene of new power dynasties of barbarian descent. Aquae diluvium, a deluge of water, Paolo Diacono the Longobard wrote, that is believed not to have happened since Noah's time. The countryside and small villages were reduced to ruins. There was a great loss of human lives and of animals. Paths were swept away and roads destroyed. Even the rivers, the Isonzo, the Natisso, Cumturo, and further west the Adige, changed their course, perhaps due to erosion or because of scarce maintenance. The waters of the Timavo lost force. The land became swampy. The coastline changed. The sea distanced itself. The gravel of the river hides what remains of the villas that were abandoned. The Lacus Timavi became desert, the desert, the loco deserta. The ancient gods no longer exist. The Homeric heroes will not return, nor will the kings and the warriors, the sailors and the merchants. Just the echo of the water and the rustle of the wind that moves the shadow of the trees remain to tell a forgotten story.